Welcome to Being Becoming Podcast. Together we are being honest in conversations we're having. Oh, I did that wrong. Let me try that again. A little rusty. Welcome to Being Becoming Podcast. Together we are being honest in conversations about thoughts we're having and books we're reading in the hopes of becoming better, more able versions of our current selves. My name is Logan Hauer. Today we will be discussing Chapter 7, Pursue What is Meaningful, Not What is Expedient, from 12 Rules for Life and Antidote for Chaos by Jordan Peterson. I'm joined today by my two good friends and co-hosts, Patrick Dyer and Austin Stone. How are we doing, fellas?
Hello.
Excellent.
Awesome. Well, it's just kind of an overview for this chapter. It's quite long, but Peterson, again, has a lot of biblical references. I think there's some religious references outside of Christianity, but it appears to be mostly a Christian background he's alluding to or writing about. But then we also talk about work and sacrifice, delayed gratification. A lot of the biblical stories include Abraham and Isaac, Mary and Jesus, Adam and Eve. We even have a section about Socrates, Cain and Abel. Socrates is not in the Bible, to clarify, but so he's just another reference, but there's quite a bit. Jesus' temptations in the desert, problems with Christianity today, freedom,
For sure.
pushing past nihilism. This list is getting rather long, but then we kind of top it off with some moral conclusions at the end of the chapter. So I guess the best way to do this is to just jump right in, and I'll turn it over to you guys just to get initial thoughts.
This is my favorite chapter so far, for sure. Patrick and I were talking about this is the second longest chapter. Did you have any thoughts, Patrick, or did you want me to start us off with a question?
I'll just reiterate my favorite chapter 2, actually, as a matter of fact. So hit us up with that cue.
Yeah. Peterson kind of starts the chapter off with this, but he kind of asks, is pleasure enough to make the suffering of life worth it? So Peterson kind of I think he stated this before, but he says, life is suffering, or I prefer to say, in life there's suffering. It's just inevitable. So he's like, okay, what can humans do to make that suffering of life to where life doesn't feel meaningless? And is like, is pursuing pleasure enough? And that's kind of one of his first questions that he asks.
I mean, that's a big question.
Yeah, no, it is. Was it Sigmund Freud, that had maybe more of that kind of inclination as far as pleasure being the most fulfilling desire or something?
Well, Freud reduced all human motivation to sexuality. So that's in the same ballpark for sure.
Huh. Well, given the title of this chapter, I'd be inclined to say that pleasure isn't the only motivating factor, the most motivating factor for people.
Depends on their experience.
Seems to be kind of a safety net, right? Like, I mean, Peterson himself says,
Definitely.
the pleasure of expediency may be fleeting, but it's pleasure nonetheless. And that's something to stack up against the terror of pain in existence.
Yeah, that's a good starting point, for sure. Would much rather have pleasure than suffering. Or at least the suffering we do have, we'd want to control the degree to which we are suffering. You know, we want to take it on voluntarily instead of having it being imposed on us.
Right.
But Pat, I kind of wanted to press into what you were saying there.
What was the question again?
No, Patrick is definitely onto something, because I think that's exactly why Peterson starts talking about sacrifice. It's trying to find a worthiness in life is a very difficult thing for humans, and it's something that we've been working on for as long as we've been around. And Peterson mentions, oh yeah, humans figured out that sacrifice is one way to try to live a meaningful life, because of course picking pleasure, or what we might call expediency, is easy and handed, but maybe there's actually something better if you wait, if you sacrifice that present pleasure, you know. And that's where he starts to talk about Abraham and how sacrifice is mentioned in the Old Testament scriptures.
It's truly amazing how much faith you have to believe and act as if you believe the title of this chapter is true. Delaying gratification for something meaningful takes a lot of effort and faith.
Yeah. And I don't think there's any other animal that delays gratification, or at least to the extent that humans would.
Not consciously. Yeah, that's probably true. Yeah.
I guess, yeah, squirrels hiding nuts for
That's a thing.
hibernation or
Yeah.
whatever. Yeah, but I guess that's delayed gratification.
But it's their natural way.
Yeah, there's not planning or bargaining with the future. It's more of them accepting the reality that there's going to be a cold winter and I need to set food aside. But yeah, maybe
Yeah.
I guess, I don't know. Maybe that is some kind of delayed gratification or... Anyways, I'm getting kind of down a rabbit trail or a squirrel trail. Yeah, I guess I was more meaning that the degree to which we sacrifice for the future is pretty astounding. And it's allowed for the progression of our culture, humanity,
Right.
accepting that I'm going to put in a week's worth of work and at the end of that week or 2 weeks, accept payment. I mean, and some people could just get paid at the end of the day, so maybe that's a bad example. But the things that we're aiming at, which I think that was part of chapter 6 as far as talking a lot about what's our aim. And I think this one follows up pretty nicely in that what are we willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of that aim, or in the pursuit of being right with God or others, you know, the world around us.
Yeah. Peterson defines sacrifice as something better might be attained in the future by giving up something of value in the present. And that's what you were saying, Logan.
Off of that thought too, Austin, he mentions the social contract as being a way to organize society, and he defined it as a causal relationship between our efforts today and the quality of tomorrow, and that ability allows us to work with others well, to form trust. Again, I think a lot of that is things that either just happen in the background or we take for granted. There's a work or an effort going on, but then there's also a social implication with that you could enter into with your neighbor. So you borrow a ladder from your neighbor today so that when tomorrow they come over asking you for a cup of sugar, you're more likely to lend that to them because you kind of have this understanding of we help each other out. I'm going to have less today or be without something today in order to help someone else, because in the future there might come a time when I need to call on that same person for assistance.
Makes sense.
And this leads into when Peterson talked about Socrates. So Peterson starts talking about pleasure and then sacrifice, and then the idea of your conscious kinds of pops in. So Socrates asked a bunch of people different questions, you know, questions about existence, questions about reality, things that people didn't tend to ask about. And he just questions, and he got put on trial for quote unquote corrupting the youth. There was a good way for him to get out of this trial, but he says he had this thing in his brain he called the daemon, the diamond, and it's whatever he felt like was wrong, and whenever this voice in his head told him not to do something, he always never did it. And it was like, don't try to get out of this trial. He was already old, and he's a really good orator, so he could have argued his way out of this, but he wanted to stay true. They said, you were here corrupting the youth, and he's like, no, don't think I did anything wrong, like just asking questions. And then he got killed for that. So there are some moments that humans chose death to keep their conscious, so they sacrificed their own life for an idea. And that's something that Peterson was like, that's significant. Why do humans do that?
I have a couple thoughts, Austin, real quick. So when you were talking about the daemon, or I think that's what you were saying the term was, immediately I was like, okay, that's probably a conscience, or what we would call a conscience today. So that's really interesting that even at that point, he had the understanding of what his conscience was and was trying to act maybe obediently or at least I guess you could say in a way in which he thought was right, even to the point of death. I also think, am I remembering correctly that while he was on trial, the way he presented his case was very interesting. I think this was with Socrates, and I might have gotten this from another podcast. I'm trying to remember. It was one of those guys when they were about to be executed. He started off his plea not from like a great orating perspective, but from a trying to be reasonable and understandable. He wasn't arguing his point or trying to belabor his point, but instead was rather just trying to reasonably speak to the crowd, because I think he had to address the crowd. And they ended up calling for him to be executed because he wasn't being argumentative. Yeah. So I think I might have gotten that from another podcast. I couldn't remember if that was this chapter or not.
I think that's Socrates, though. And here's a philosophical side note real quick is Socrates didn't write anything of his own. So all we know about Socrates' death is through Plato. So Plato wrote about it, and there's like another account of it. What was happening at that time were what these group of philosophers called the sophists, and the sophists were kind of what we would consider lawyers today, right? They could argue anything, even a ridiculous argument, they could make it sound plausible in front of a jury. And Plato and Aristotle were like, I think there's something more meaningful than just proving that you're right or just having good oratorical or rhetorical skills. Like, there's something to existence that's structured and real rather than just, I can just argue anything. So I think that they definitely mentioned Socrates' death to show that there's other stuff worth dying for than just being right.
That is
helpful to have the context around some of these characters when we're learning or reading about them. So thank you, Austin, for sharing that. I think also in that same vein, a lot of biblical characters get referenced, and some of the ones I named off at the beginning, Abraham and Isaac, Mary and Jesus, Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Jesus and Satan in the desert with his temptations. I don't know if you guys wanted to talk about any one of those subjects in particular, or just had some observations based on your own reading of certain material or on this chapter specifically.
Could I actually mention a passage in James that reminds me of what we were talking about? When Peterson was talking about Socrates and following his consciousness, that reminds me of James chapter 4 verse 17 when James says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and does not do it, it is a sin for them. So even in a biblical context, I think our Creator wants us to follow our consciousness, in line, as long as we're walking in the Spirit and living in submission to God's Word. Like, I think that our consciousness is something that works in tandem with the Spirit. And while Socrates is not, in the canon, I think there's something to following your conscience.
Definitely. Have you ever felt guilty accepting the pleasure, not denying it, whatever it may be? I can certainly say yes, for sure.
Yeah, just pleasure in general or specific.
Not even necessarily a sin, just something.
Right. Like, I should not have eaten 5 Reese's bars.
Even something as small as that.
Yeah, that's the one for me too. My recent thing has been fantasy hockey. Reading up on players and matchups and all of this stuff, and I know that it's not the best use of my time, but I've been looking at that in the morning, right when I get up. I'm getting right into this pleasure seeking, or it's not even pleasure. I mean, it's satisfying, gratifying, I guess, like an impulse, but...
Well, you said satisfying. That makes that a much more solid issue, is the satisfaction you mentioned. If it weren't satisfactory, we would have to probably figure out why, see what kind of spectrum we're on. But yeah, we'll need to keep that in mind throughout this chapter.
We got the resident psychological nurse on the mic right now, folks. He's ready to diagnose your problems.
And I'll do so quickly.
And Pat, are you making a distinguishment between satisfaction versus gratification or expediency? Is there a distinction to be drawn?
Let's see. I hate saying this because it's going to sound like such a postmodernist, but it'll probably depend on the individual. Because I know I can think personally, I might label something for myself satisfactory, but not be gratified from it, or vice versa.
Right.
But I'm sure some people would probably label the two the same.
Do you think gratifying maybe has a more positive connotation, whereas satisfactory is maybe more neutral?
It sounds like it, but no.
If it's connected to gratefulness, then gratifying gratefulness.
See, it sounds like it, just how it sounds, but the literal aspect of it would be a no.
Oh, okay.
Because you can be gratified in a terrible sin in yourself. It may not be a good thing or grateful thing, since those words are intertwined, but the actual gratification will be individual basis, probably. Same with the satisfaction aspect. That's why I hate words. This sucks.
No.
That's why I love words, because I think it is interesting to think about what's the implication of the connotation versus what is the reality of the denotation.
I never became so interested in what words actually mean and meant until reading books like this one. Because the way you say things actually matters. Yeah. It's a big deal, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
You have to be very precise.
I would love to cover a couple things on Cain and Abel with you too.
I love that story.
Because I came across something. Tell me if you think this is crazy. So Peterson breaks down Cain and Abel, and he breaks down Cain's murderous desires. Cain and Abel is after the tree of the knowledge of good and evil has been eaten. Mm-hmm. So once you're aware of the knowledge of good and evil, Peterson says eating that tree made humans conscious. Like, that was the attainment of consciousness. I'm not here to argue that. So he says once you've become consciously aware that you're vulnerable, because you eat the knowledge of good and evil, once you become aware that you're vulnerable, what did Adam and Eve do? They covered themselves up because they realized they were naked. Once you become conscious in that way, like self-conscious, like, oh, I'm self-conscious, of my body image or whatever. So once you realize that you're vulnerable, you understand what pain means. And then once you truly understand those feelings in yourself, and you know how they're produced in yourself, you can understand how to produce them in others. And this is what Cain does. And then a light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, that is the inverse of the golden rule. Cain lived the inverse of the golden rule. Love your neighbor as yourself. But Cain said, I know what good and evil is. I know what pain is. I'm going to learn how to produce that in my brother, and I guess towards God, because I'm so infuriated with how reality is. He was mad at God that he was not getting recognition when his brother was, even though he put work in, even though he experienced the suffering of work, there was not satisfaction from God. In God's defense, he said, hey, check yourself before you wreck yourself. I'm giving you a chance here. But no, he went ahead and produced that pain and murdered, did the first killing. So does that make
100%.
sense to you guys?
Yeah.
I think you explained that very well, Austin. I want to ask you guys a question based off of what Austin just said. What did you guys think about Peterson saying the future is a judgmental father? Ooh. And do you think that applies in the Cain and Abel story?
It definitely relates to his idea on sacrifice, right? Because if you believe that the future is a judgmental father, then you're going to be willing to sacrifice things now so that you can be judged favorably later in the future.
Out of probably both fear and reverence.
Right.
Okay, so does that mean we will all eventually be like Cain if we don't pursue what is meaningful? Probably. To some degree.
Sin is crouching at all of our doors, that's for sure.
So if you keep denying it, you should be fine. But once it gets the foothold, you're kind of done. I didn't think about it like that till now. I'll have to think about that more.
Many times, even in this podcast, I've mentioned that passage when God is talking to Cain and is pleading him. He says, why are you downcast? And he says, sin is crouching at your door, waiting to grab a hold of you, master it, So I think that is such a powerful passage, in just the first few chapters of Genesis.
Master it. I like that a lot.
Pat, I'm still thinking about your comment on could we all become Cain if we're not sacrificing for the
Well,
future?
I was more trying to speak in like maybe a foolish absolute, but I was like, will we actually be Cain instead of not could be? Because of course we could be.
Oh, I see.
But how far along
Right.
down the line do you go until you do something so evil?
I think part of the Cain and Abel story that's interesting to me is that Cain was making sacrifices. They just were not pleasing to God, and I don't believe we get an understanding as to why they were not pleasing with God. Oh, do we?
Yeah, Abel gave the first of his fruits, Cain did not. So Abel gave his very best.
Oh, okay.
Oh, was it not the first?
Abel gave his all, his best, his highest level of produce, and Cain did not.
He's intentionally choosing.
Yes, exactly.
I think the modern application would be that it would be easy to become disheartened if you are sacrificing what you have in the present, for working towards something in the future,
Right.
but then that's just not panning out. God's quote unquote displeased with that sacrifice, even though you're trying your best or what you believe to be your best, which I think would be different than Cain's situation where he's intentionally trying to save his best work for now and just give his seconds for the future or for the sacrifice.
And he probably did so begrudgingly. And we know all over in Scripture, probably every other book, I swear, it says, God loves a cheerful giver. Certainly Cain was not, Abel probably was. And that probably speaks volumes into their relationship with God and probably with each other.
Why would you think that Cain wouldn't change his behavior to, instead of becoming resentful with his brother, could he have looked at him, saw that he was doing good or doing well and being rewarded for that and then wanting to emulate that? Where do you think maybe animosity is the right word, or resentment comes from for the brother? If he's clearly giving his second best animal or not his best herb or whatever to sacrifice, that seems to me like an easy correction.
Here's my uneducated guess on this. I think Cain did what he thought was best, and then I think God said that's not enough, and Cain in that situation should have gone to Abel and said, hey, can I get one of your sheep? And I think he wasn't willing to humble himself and ask how he could trade, for the I think he was just all out angry with him, like that Abel had what God wanted and Cain did not, and he was just gonna dwell on that anger, and he let that take over instead of humbling himself, and learning how to master over his sin and working through that, which is hard. Like, it is hard to humble yourself before a brother. If you think you did an A+ job and someone said, no, you need to learn more from the person who beat you, it's hard to overcome bitterness. Like, we know how that feels.
It is.
That's a really good point. We have the privilege, I'll preface with that too, we have the privilege of learning from stories like these. Whereas when they're in the thick of it, early on in history, I think it'd be a lot more challenging to know that, I can just go ask him for the sheep. When you're feeling that strong emotion or resentment or whatever, that he has the thing that God finds most desirable, but you're not willing to work with him or ask for help. Man, that's a really good point, Austin. And that's also, I think you're really seeing the humanity of Cain too. Because I think a lot of the times, for myself, it seems so inhumane the way he treats Abel.
Right.
And it's easy to lose sight of, no, he was us, he was just another average Joe, and acted on a bad impulse or perpetuated bad ideas and thoughts and feelings, which then led to a bad behavior or an action.
And that's something Peterson talks about, is we need to understand the capability of our shadow selves. We all need to understand we're capable, like kind of what Patrick was saying, we need to understand we're capable, of killing somebody. Like, we all as humans have access to those emotions that Cain harnessed in order to kill his brother. Like, those are human things, and you're fooling yourself if you think you don't have access to those emotions.
That's exactly right.
And just like when God was saying, it's crushing at your door, like, if you don't think you're capable of that, then I think it has the sneak attack on you.
And master it.
So.
That's that's such an interesting idea. That's suggesting, and I think we already know this anyway, but that's suggesting that temptation is not in itself sin.
Right. Which is another thing that the book of James affirms.
It will quickly get that way if it's not mastered.
Yeah, temptation might be knocking at your door, but you don't want to leave it there persisting. You want to take action against it.
And the longer you don't take action at it, like just psychologically, neurologically speaking, the more likely you will cave, which is scary to think about, unfortunately. So it's just like, how far did Cain go, though? Like, how long did he let this stir?
We don't have a time frame, but that's interesting to think about.
So a question kind of transitioning out of the Cain and Abel story. Are all sacrifices of equal quality?
No, I don't think.
I think more of what I was thinking was, say there are two people, like a Cain and Abel, two brothers, what have you, but they're both well-intentioned, and they're both giving the same sacrifice. If the story was modified to where they're both just trying their best, they're both sacrificing, but one's getting more rewarded than the other in the endeavor that they're pursuing. One is getting I guess you would say, the favor of God or the blessing that he's seeking through his sacrifice, but the other is not. Why do you think that is? Or could there be more extenuating circumstances than just the sacrifice itself?
Well, if Cain truly did give... Oh man, I hope I don't get smitten from this. Shoot. If Cain truly did give his best, gave of his best self, gave of his everything, whatever that would have entailed or meant, well, God can choose favor to whom he chooses, because he knows the intent of the heart. He knows. But if we say Cain and Abel's intent was the exact same, they both gave their best, and God showed partiality to Abel, then God is no longer a loving God or a just God. If I don't wake up tomorrow, it's because of that, y'all. Just
Well, I think I would encourage you to step back from the courtroom understanding of it and step more into a father-son relationship with it. It's just so significant to me that
good point.
God doesn't kill Cain after they both sacrifice, because we can agree that somehow or another Cain had a lesser sacrifice. So why did God not just kill him then? Well, he said he somehow showed his disapproval to Cain and then gave him a chance to even try to calm him down, Like, I see that as more of like a father-son relationship kind of situation rather than let me weigh these two workers and, what they've done, what they haven't done. I think it's important to keep in mind the context of relationship.
I really appreciate that context too, Austin, because that's something I did not take into effect. So even if, assuming all things were equal with Cain and Abel trying their best, sacrificing their best, one doing better than the other, God is still communicating with Cain on what the standard is, I'm assuming. There's still a relationship there, to your point, Austin,
right,
where it's not sufficient right now, but they are in relationship, and there is an understanding of like the expectation, and that expectation's not being met. So then there's a consequence of some kind, which would be God being displeased with the sacrifice, I think, in that situation. So I think the moral is, guys, let's just give the highest quality sacrifice that we can that would reward us with a better future. Or that could reward us with the best possible future. No?
But your intent needs to also be aligned with that too.
Correct. And don't forget about the context of relationship that we have with the Creator.
Because the cheerful heart aspect is a strong key to making it actually mean something.
Peterson said something in this chapter I think relates, and it was profound to me. Freedom requires constraint.
Yes.
Because there's not that much freedom in chaos.
In fact, pure freedom is pure chaos.
And that brings us back to what, Peterson has set before us is this chaos and order. Think of the yin-yang circle, and that squiggly line, he called that the line of consciousness. And the two circles, those are also lines of consciousness in between chaos and order. Because if you have too much order, you're going to have chaos. And if you have too much chaos...
everybody dies.
Oh, I don't know what happens next, but...
Speaking of too much chaos and people potentially dying, Abraham and Isaac, I think that's always been a story I've had trouble understanding or grasping.
Elaborate.
Just the whole being so far removed from the historical context of like child sacrifice and even just sacrificing things in general to God or to some kind of physical representation of sacrificing something. And the whole, I think the temptation, at least in my mind, is how could a loving father almost sacrifice a son, or why would a loving God require a loving father to sacrifice his son?
Logan, you just asked, why would a loving father choose to sacrifice his son?
Who isn't a perfect archetypal man?
Right, so I think the confusingness of Abraham and Isaac's story helps to illuminate the beauty of what the father did. I mean, it is very weird that God would ask him to try to sacrifice his only son, but he's like, I'm glad to know you can do it, but you don't need to do it, but I will be doing it sometime in the future.
I get it within the context of the Bible and the foreshadowing, but I'm just talking as like thinking about Joe Schmo in current day going to sacrifice his kid, it's just, I think just there's a cultural gap there that's difficult to reckon.
Yeah, I'm not sure we have to make ourselves comfortable with that. I think it's okay to be weirded out by that.
But to your point, though, Austin and Patrick, I think the significance of the foreshadowing of Abraham and Isaac mirroring then Jesus and God in the New Testament, I think that's pretty profound.
And it's also Abraham fully understood the ideal of what the highest ideal of what God wanted anyway. And it's what you love most. It's who you are. It's your everything. It's head to toe. And that's who Isaac was to Abraham. Because think of how Abraham was born anyway. It was a miracle circumstance, only given by God anyway.
Yeah, and Abraham was willing to choose a life of faith over his most prized possession, the promise that God gave himself. Yeah.
That's exactly what I said at the very beginning, is imagine the amount of faith you have to act this out.
Right.
To act out pursuing what is meaningful.
Thanks for bringing up that question again, because it seems more contextualized now.
And of course, God understands this, so it's really not so odd for him to ask of this. It's only odd to us if we don't see the grand picture or the grand ideal. Even forget the foreshadowing for a second, even in that moment, it takes the ultimate amount of faith.
Sacrificing the thing that means the most to you, the thing that even God has given to himself, then if he's requiring it, are you willing to sacrifice it? I think that's a really great question. Or at least that's what I've taken away from what you're saying, Pat.
Say it one more time.
So essentially, Abraham's very old by the time he has Isaac. It's a miracle of God that he's able to even have a child at his age and his wife's age, the complications they've had throughout their lives trying to have kids. So Isaac was given to Abraham essentially by God, and then God was requiring him back. And I was just trying to think of that more in what our lives would look like. So if we had something that was given to us by God, a job, a situation, a relationship, but we were then called to sacrifice that back to God, the understanding or the faith to which you're speaking, at least from what I've understood, is that this was only possible because of God to begin with. This was granted to me through faith. I must remain faithful in sticking to what God has asked of me, and even if it requires sacrificing the thing I love most.
That's I love that, Logan.
Yeah, perfect summary. Yeah.
Did you guys have anything specifically on this Abraham and Isaac story that you wanted to add?
Back to Cain and Abel, there's one thing I wanted to add. It's just a line I highlighted. He just says, here's the rub. Sometimes when things are not going well, it's not the world that's the cause. The cause is instead which is currently most valued subjectively and personally. For some reason, I was just thinking that from like Cain's perspective, like he clearly is valuing not the highest regard. He's doing so subjectively, and personally, it's probably his personality and his nature and nurture aspect that brought him to who he was at the moment.
Let me know if this lines with kind of what you're thinking. You could even read that as he's too much in love with his present circumstance or situation, even though it's not yielding for him the most amount of happiness, satisfaction, whatever you want to call it. His current situation is not benefiting his well-being the most, but he's so in love with the situation he's in, he's unwilling to change or to let go.
Yep.
Right.
Because I think that's a very relatable place. I can think personally, there's some habits or whatnot that I do, which if I changed, I could probably feel better and be happier. I know we were talking about before we started recording, going to the gym or trying to do that more regularly. I know I would be more happier if I did this. I could make the time in my schedule, but I'm not, because I'm too in love with the current version of the way things are, or at least maybe not in love, but appeased with the way everything is around me now, to where I'm not willing to take on the additional burden or sacrifice to feel better. And I know I would feel better if I did it, but I'm not.
Oh yeah, it does. That war is always raging.
It seems like a very human problem.
Yeah, I suppose it is. And I guess later on in the same paragraph, the reason we feel that way is kind of what Jordan Peterson says here. It's your current presuppositions that have come from your experience, which has then led to an indeterminate degree through which you have placed your values. And then he says it's time to let go.
Yeah.
There was a quote that I wrote down in the Abraham and Isaac story that I think ties in with what you were just saying as far as with the letting go piece. I wrote down that Jordan is essentially saying, or his position kind of with the Abraham and Isaac story, is that a part is offered symbolically to redeem the whole.
Whoa, yeah.
And then my question is, do we agree? Ultimate sacrifice for ultimate prize.
Circumcision. That was a Jewish practice to embody that exact
That's exactly
principle.
right. Yeah.
But no, sorry, Austin. I don't mean to belittle your point, because that is exactly on par with, what that entails, I think.
Yeah.
Would you agree that that's a good summarization of the Abraham and Isaac story?
I can dig it. I'm now ready to talk about the corruption of Christianity.
Do you have any specific thoughts, Austin, on that?
There's a quote that Peterson has is Carl Jung said this. He's quoting Carl Jung here. Christianity, with its laser-like emphasis on spiritual salvation, had failed to sufficiently address the problem of suffering in the here and now. So, the fact that the church, Christianity, had trouble, was focusing so much on spiritual salvation, you could start to think about the Catholic Church comes to mind, right? These relics, trying to kind of buy your way to heaven. And then this is where the Enlightenment flourishes, because they're trying to find human answers to human problems, because the church is not really focusing on the suffering of the here and now, which I found fascinating and kind of in line with a lot of what I've studied with church history and, the secularization of the modern world.
I wrote that down, that the church was focused on spiritual salvation instead of the suffering of the here and now. Do you think it would be fair to say that prior to the Renaissance, the church had just dismissed the problem altogether, or was maybe postulating the problem as, oh, the suffering that you're enduring here and now will be redeemed in heaven, And would that have discouraged people to have stopped trying to address problems that were causing them to suffer? Because they were ultimately clinging to the hope that there would just come a time where there would be no suffering, and they just had to accept it wouldn't be in this world. There was nothing they could do.
You know what that reminds me of, Logan, is white slave owners in America preaching the gospel to slaves, saying, you don't need freedom on earth, go ahead and be satisfied in your slavery because you're going to have freedom in heaven. That's kind of what they'd use to comfort them,
I think that seems right on par with what I'm imagining the conversation would have been between the church and, I guess you could say, common folk or peasants or whoever else of the, I'm assuming, medieval time would be. There are problems that were worth addressing, that needed to be addressed, but, you're trying to live and get through the day, and these problems are probably complex, and you're clinging to the hope that you have in heaven, which is a real hope, but
Yes.
maybe it's dismissing the issue at hand in the here and now.
Right. How terrible is it that the oppressor is hiding behind that hope?
Right.
No. Yeah, you're gonna get it,
Wow.
Mister.
Right.
Yeah. And I've studied a little bit about how Christianity became corrupted after it started becoming institutionalized. So after Constantine made it the state religion, this continues on into the Catholic Church, trying to institutionalize kindness. You just can't do that. Once you start doing that, you start trying to incentivize kindness. And then you start incentivizing salvation with, relics. And, now you can buy. And then it becomes this corrupted thing where it's not about trying to get people to be kind. It's about getting more money and using salvation to do that. And then you get the confusion of church and state when Jesus was just trying to start a subversive kingdom until he comes back, led by discipleship, life on life relationships, not world domination.
Yahtzee.
Yeah. Wow. Oh my gosh.
And then I got confused when I moved on to page 186, because then he starts talking about how Christianity did do a good job at showing that humans can be equal. There's a king and there's a peasant, and the gospel's saying, you know what, these two people can be on the same playing field.
I do remember that section. I believe you might have even texted Patrick and I about this specifically. But if I want to understand your position, though, is that you don't think that was what was indeed happening?
Be more specific. What are you talking about?
So Peterson is essentially talking about the one problem, I guess you could call it, that Christianity was solving consistently was that the king and the peasant were on equal terms. They were of equal value as humans, and that gets written into Western common law. Do you take any issue with that summarization?
The westernization of Christianity is complicated, and I think that Peterson brings up a fair dimension to it. I don't think that it's definitive, but yes, Bible reading followers of Jesus can say yes, a king and a peasant are all on the same playing field in Christ. But was that played out in history? I mean, kind of, like Luther kind of started to do that with the Reformation, and that did start kind of tearing down a lot of the foundations of the Catholic Church. So yeah, I could see that, but then that's also when slavery started in America. So I don't really see them humanizing the neighbor. Like when he brought that up, it just
fair point.
It was hard for me because it was like, you're talking really generally, Peterson. Like, what do you mean? And what you said 2 pages ago is contradicting what you're saying now. So
on the one hand, we have Christianity is leveling the playing field between power structures. And then what was...
On the other hand, Christianity is focusing so much on salvation that they're ignoring suffering.
Oh, I see. Okay, I'm with you.
Just a page difference. Yeah, that was hard for me.
So would it be fair to say, because I see that tension you're talking about now, Austin. Yeah, there's a claim that they're not doing anything to address suffering on earth. Or at least they're not doing much, I guess you could say. They're not doing much to address suffering in the here and now. But then also, one of the biggest sources of suffering has to do with the king receiving a large portion of everything and everybody else receiving almost nothing. And the argument is that that is being addressed during this time. So could it be a matter as simple as the church wasn't actively doing anything, but there was an inactive consequence?
This is correct. Yes.
Okay.
And I think the reason why he brings up like the level playing field on 186 is that he kind of mentions how that the hierarchical slave-based societies of our ancestors reorganized themselves. So he says, kind of after the Enlightenment, it's the first time ever that we realized, oh, slavery is not humane.
Oh.
Which is confusing to me because that's kind of obvious even when Paul is writing letters. But then it takes a while for the church to catch up to that.
I had understood that, and maybe my understanding could be wrong, but I was understanding him to mean in the here and now, we know that slavery is wrong because of all of these things that have happened throughout history. Whereas before the Enlightenment, it was understood that if you could get a person to do work that you wanted to be done without paying them, that was a desirable feat throughout most of history. But then Christianity introduced people are valuable and you should not be treating them in a manner that you yourself would not be okay with being treated.
Right.
And that's the ideal. Again, we're not going to hit that perfectly all the time or every time, but that's maybe the thing we're working towards or closer to.
Yeah, on page 186 he brings up some good points. I just wish he had more examples to make it more concrete.
I think that's fair as well. And I think it's tough because this chapter's already so long. I wonder, maybe there could have been stuff there that just got edited out.
That's probably true.
You know, it's tough to know. But I think, regardless, that's a fair point, Austin, that you're addressing.
And I want to walk away from this section being thankful that, and I quote, Christianity made explicit the surprising claim that even the lowliest person had rights, genuine rights. Jesus values each and everyone's humanity. And how beautiful is that for Jesus followers to enter into community with? What are you thinking, Patrick?
I'm trying to remember what he was speaking on in the nihilism section and how that relates to everything we've discussed so far. It definitely seems like, and this is a very gross statement, but just thinking through us three growing up, the most nihilistic among us, in fact, do what is expedient the most.
Whoa.
Yeah, I'm not going to say names, but...
Well, there's nothing to sacrifice for, right?
Well, it's nothing that they've identified that's worthy to be sacrificed for, rather.
Yeah, if everything is meaningless, then there's nothing worth sacrificing anything for.
So, in fact, I'll just go and live how I want, which is exactly what they should do. Otherwise, they're in contradiction with themselves. Yeah, it's just an interesting realization that this idea of nihilism is very strong.
I had something I wanted to add into nihilism being strong. I think something that Peterson referenced that Nietzsche brought up was that individuals invent their own values after the quote-unquote death of God.
That's the
Yes.
postmodern idea.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. And I wonder if that is part of the problem because
Yes.
people's values can
Yes.
vary quite drastically. I like the Carl Jung quote as well, kind of in the same realm of, can we impose what we believe on our souls? And I think that directly addresses the nihilistic point as well, which I know we've talked about quite extensively in other chapters as well, but I think continues to be an area of interest for us. But I like this idea that Jung is quoted in, I think he's quoted in, or at least referenced in this chapter, because we can require or demand so much of other people, but what do we actually believe, and what are we willing to go through in order to stay true to that belief?
Yes. And Logan, that is why the death of God, quote unquote, that Nietzsche proclaimed in the 20th century is what brought forth communism and fascism. Because they thought they could make their own value structures, but then they just turned into extreme political ideologies.
With the ideology aspect, I thought it was interesting that ideas, at least the way they are framed in this chapter, are not the same as facts. Ideas, according to Peterson, are more of a personality. That resonated with me. Facts are dead. Ideas are alive. Ideas that grip a person are alive.
Yep.
And either the person has to die or the idea has to die.
Yes. Which is why Socrates died.
Exactly. That ties back into what we were talking about earlier. You have to eventually let go of an idea or
find an idea that's worth dying for.
Is it an idea that's worth dying for? Then hold on to it. If it's not, let it go.
Yes.
And with the communism one, how many millions of people had to pay that consequence because of bad ideology that people weren't willing to let go of?
It's like Jordan Peterson says, people don't have ideas, ideas have people.
Oh, I like that.
And we've talked about this in other chapters, is that ideologies are not strong enough for the meaning of human life for it to be sustained on. It has to be, these religious structures that we found in Christianity.
Dang, there's just so much more. This is crazy. This chapter's nuts. Ah, man.
I think that suffering is real. Infliction of suffering on another for its own sake is wrong. Just that on its own seems like it doesn't need to be debated. Regardless of your belief structure is, I guess, what I'm saying. Infliction of suffering on another for its own sake, suffering for its own sake is wrong. And I was talking earlier about suffering that you're voluntarily taking on is different than suffering that's being imposed upon you by another person tyrannically.
Conscious human malevolence can break the spirit even when tragedy could not shake it. That's from Peterson, because he talks about how humans were facing the tragedy and the suffering of life, but then how much worse it is when there's conscious human artful infliction of suffering on someone from somebody else. And he was like, I might not be able to know anything, kind of like Descartes. He's like, I don't know anything except that I can think. Peterson says, no, I only know that I can say that the artful infliction of suffering on someone else is wrong. He's like, I know that that's wrong.
It's kind of interesting also to think, just a random thought, like not much more shows that people truly have freedom to choose and free will. It shows that we are so free that we can pick to suffer and deny expedience.
Yeah.
Right. The problem of most of humanity seemed to be, how can I get this person or whatever to stop imposing all these things on me so that I can just live my life peacefully and...
Like we're trying to do now. Thanks, government. Screw you.
This podcast brought to you by the National Government Association of Public Monitoring and Surveillance, and also by Skechers.
Yeah, because it's so interesting to think, just like Jesus taking up his own cross, literally carrying it, like that willful choice, like we're supposed to follow suit. So the magnitude is 10 out of 10. And then that's back to like Cain and Abel. Abel probably gave that 10 out of 10. Cain missed the mark. Aim wasn't high enough.
To have meaning in your life is better than to have what you want, because you may never know what you want, nor what you truly need.
I think that ties into the moral conclusions that Peterson talks about as well, because he talks about, in that section, value structure aimed at betterment reveals a life-sustaining meaning. So if you don't have that value structure, you're aiming blind, or maybe you're just disinterested with aiming at anything or finding meaning. But I think the question could be, how can I use my time to make things better instead of worse? And that could be a good place to start. I think a lot of times one of the things with Peterson that I find is that he has such an idea of what the values are and the beliefs should be. It seems like there's almost like a quantitative process to value. I personally do not find myself, even though I have values, I'm not consciously thinking through them necessarily all the time to, okay, what am I aiming at? What am I valuing? Are they in alignment? I'm not doing that necessarily daily or weekly. Maybe I should be. The thing that I underlined and bolded in the notes was this question of how can I use my time to make things better instead of worse? And I think that's a great way to start, because it could be conversations. Something I've caught myself doing is I've been more negative than I normally am. Just situations popping up, frustrating me a lot quicker than they normally would. And I have to repent of that because I don't want to be making things worse because my attitude is not in a good place. Because situations are going to pop up that are challenging, stressful at work or in your personal life, but you don't necessarily want to make things worse. You're trying to make them better. So I'm trying to use my time, my energy to make that situation better, even if it's small or seemingly meaningless. And it could just be me having a better attitude about, even before I address the situation, just checking myself. No pride, no arrogance to the extent that I can, and trying to be helpful and positive too. By attending our moral obligations, we could be making the world a better place. Even in Socrates' case, it cost him his life, but we most likely don't have that same dilemma to stay true to our moral obligations or to die. It's not that dramatic for us, so
Thankfully.
we can at least try our best to stay true to ourselves, what we believe. I feel like that's a perfect transition out of the nihilism conversation. Even if you're claiming to not believe anything, I would assume that you would have some sort of conscious moral obligations that you would want to follow. And then once you start following those, you could start thinking that question of how do I make things better instead of worse? I think that naturally stems out of the following your moral obligations. And then you can, at that point, I think, have a better aim. What am I actually trying to do? Now that I'm following these moral beliefs that I have, and I'm trying to make things better instead of worse, what am I trying to make better instead of worse? Like, where am I spending my time and what do I value? And I think those things all could flow out of each other naturally.
Right on, Logan. Meaning is when many levels of being arrange themselves into functional harmony.
Ooh.
And for followers of Jesus, one of the top levels of being is living inside the story of Creator and living inside the story that Jesus has fulfilled for us.
Beautiful.
Which gives meaning and it's something to live for and things to work on doing better with.
I was just going to say, this is probably nitpicking, but it's better to not be true to yourself because yourself is more biased towards Cain archetypically. Most people, maybe not, but because I'm just thinking personally, I'm like, no, if I were to be true to myself, I definitely would pursue expedience way more.
That's a good discrepancy to make. I like that.
Because I, in fact, am actually denying myself literally daily things that could come so easy that I would enjoy, find satisfaction and gratification in, but it would bring me down.
Is that what you were saying, Austin? The staying true to yourself? Who was saying stay true to yourself?
Peterson said, like, start trying to trust yourself more. Like, trust your judgment more.
Oh, I took that more as build trust with yourself. Like, assume that you are Cain. Then do small incremental things to build trust with yourself. And then once you've established trust with yourself, try helping your neighbor with something. That's the way I was kind of taking it. No?
I guess you would have to decide if nihilism is your innate inclination or not.
Yeah.
For all this to work out.
I think what we could assume is that we're Cain. Like what you were saying, Pat. Assume you're that. You have that capacity for evil, for harm, and then work out from there. Instead of viewing yourself as altruistic, archetypal, perfect person. Let's assume the opposite first. Let's assume we're Cain. We're envious, we're vindictive. Yep. We're not willing to sacrifice enough or to work hard enough to do X, Y, and Z. Start there and then work forward.
Yeah, I like that.
That's why I've had trouble with the term self-love. which is a crucial thing we need to talk about in our society. But on another level, I don't know how to love myself. Are you kidding? You know, like Patrick said, I would choose expediency. So what do we need? We need the Holy Spirit to guide us, you know, and the Holy Spirit will. Jesus's burden is light. His yoke is easy, you know. It'll bring us to a place of peace. And that's the best way to love yourself, if you ask me, is to walk with our Creator.
And it takes purpose and effort and a true decision, because Paul, of course, says, you know, put on this and that, speaking of the armor of God, and that takes an actual point in time decision. I am going to do this. And
yeah, that's one of the biggest paradoxes of our faith, is carry your own cross so that you can have the lightest yoke.
Exactly.
You know, it doesn't make sense,
That's
but
exactly
it makes
right.
sense.
That's exactly
right.
right.
You have to make the biggest sacrifices in order to have the lightest yoke, to have the most peace.
And when you do that together in unity, oh my gosh, then life's good. It
is not a solo project. Thank you for saying that, Patrick. Amen.
Wow. Dang. I really like that last part with the carrying the cross, giving you a lighter yoke. Oh, man.
I want to say something, though, and this is, again, nitpicking. I don't know why nitpicking's on my brain right now. Dang. I guess thinking of us naturally, like as people, who we are, but I'm looking at myself from what I hope is my Christian lens, and I'm thinking back when I was a teenager, when I was at like my happiest, and when I consider life was when it was the best. And it was when I was truly in community with other believers, which would be you guys and others.
Yeah.
And at that moment, I found it easiest to deny expedience. It was just so much easier because I think I knew who was around me and I knew what the aim was. And that made everything just follow along. Like it made the narrow path easier to follow because we were together.
Community reinforced your pursuit of meaning.
Exactly. Yeah.
Wow.
Because I was going to say along the point, like, because now I live alone and I'm hardly involved with many people here in Texas. And I'm just like, there's so many things that present themselves to me that I could so easily pick that are expedient. But I know for the future it would be devastating. So it's harder for me now to deny. It's because it feels like the pull is stronger, but I think it feels like the pull is stronger because I'm not in with who made life the best anyway. Like you and Logan and then the Schmitz and the Akers and stuff like that. So
I'm relating. I'm having trouble, you know, we kind of left Chicago because we were having trouble finding community. So being alone does hurt that process of seeking meaning. And
being alone is like a weird feedback loop. And I know this from listening to my sister Grace and then obviously Ian, my brother, talk about like their studies in psychology. And Ian, by the way, he's about to graduate and be a acute care nurse practitioner. And it seems like people who are alone, like it snowballs. Like that's what they rather do.
Yeah. Peterson even gave some advice for people struggling with depression is try not to think so much about yourself. Like when you're with someone, try to actually ask them a question that's about themselves because that's kind of what depression is. And I'm no expert, Patrick, but would you agree that depression is kind of a feedback loop in and of itself?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say I'm not someone who is depressed, but I know that when I'm feeling down, I start asking myself more questions that I don't need to be asking myself.
Isn't that crazy? Yeah. That's exactly what we were just talking about.
Why am I feeling this way? I used to be so happy. I used to smile just all the time, but then I have to correct myself. That's not true. It's okay to feel sad. You're not happy all the time. Your guys' point about there's something about being alone too, or feeling alone, that compounds those thoughts. Yeah.
Yes. Ooh, we need to turn this podcast off so I can talk about some personal stuff because that is right on, man.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you for tuning in to this week's book club discussion. Please let us know if you have any suggestions as to books we should read or topics we should discuss by contacting us at beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. Again, That's beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. We hope you join us next week for another conversation.